Good morning. Can you guys hear me okay? Yep, good. All right. Thank you for coming here. It's a Wednesday morning. I come from Seattle, so it's quite early for me. So nothing like coffee and a bunch of IAM, right, to get you started on Wednesday. So my name is Ujjwal Pugalia. I'm a senior product manager with the AWS Identity team. And I'm going to be talking today about using analytics to set access controls in AWS. Before I move on, we have an official AWS Identity Twitter handle. It's a great source to get more information about feature launches and new development in the AWS identity space. So please follow that for more information. All right, so today I'm going to start quickly about a summary of what at least I mean when I say access controls in AWS. I'm going to move on to describe a model, an access control model that supports innovation, or we believe that supports innovation. Talk about some tools that help you dial in permissions over time. And then finally, really excited about this, I'm going to show some demos about a feature that we launched just last Friday, so it's really recent, about how you can do that for permission guardrails across accounts. So we have some related breakout sessions that will go deeper into specific topics that I'm going to touch upon. That's later in the day today. My colleague Ray is going to be going deeper into AWS Organizations. I'm going to be talking about one specific part of it. Becky, who's a principal engineer in identity, she's going to be talking about enforcing security invariants in AWS. And finally, Bridget, who's my manager, she's going to be talking about scaling permissions in AWS using attribute-based access control, or ABAC. So do catch them if you can. All right, so let's start by talking about access controls in AWS. There are a lot of different access controls in AWS. For this session, I'm going to be specifically talking about access control when it comes to the IAM perspective, or access controls in the IAM perspective. Basically, everything we do in the IAM space boils down to 4 words. Who can access what, right? The who is basically your workforce users, and they're sort of represented in IAM in either IAM roles or IAM users that you create. The can access part, which is the access controlling part, is what I'm going to be focusing on today. That defines basically who can access what. And finally, the what is the AWS resources that you create in your accounts. All right, so even within IAM, right, there are multiple types of permissions that you can define through different policies. Some of them are identity-based policies, which basically means you attach them to your users, and it basically tells them what they can access or what resources they can access. And then you have resource-based policies, which are attached to the resources, and resource-based policies basically tell resources who can access them. Right? I'm going to be going deeper into identity-based policies, but after this session, I can stick around if you have questions about resource-based policies. All right, so just like security and compliance, even with access controls, there is sort of a shared ownership, shared responsibility model between AWS and its customers. Your job as customers is specification. You define who can access what. And our job at AWS is basically looking at your specification and making sure that our AWS services and the applications that you build on it evaluate what you've specified and basically follow it in accordance. I promise this is the only animation in my slide. But basically, if you want to, what I want to really drive in here is that even though there's a shared ownership model, that doesn't mean that we can't help you make permission decisions for your environments, right? What we're trying to do at AWS is use data analytics to help you simplify your job of specifying access controls or managing permissions in AWS. And I'm going to dive deeper into what this data analysis or what these tools are that can help you here. All right. Now that we have a quick summary of sort of the scope that we are talking about in this session, I wanted to introduce an access control model that we believe supports innovation. A lot of times security teams want to follow the principle of least privilege, right? So the principle of least privilege basically is a security practice that says you need to limit your users' rights to only what they need to use to do their work. But this inherently does not, or it's in some way a conflict with innovation that your developers or your business teams want to do, right? They want to test out new services that are available on the cloud. They want to build custom projects for themselves in their sandbox environments and whatnot. So this is the model that we think supports or inspires innovation. It starts off, it's basically a threefold process. Starts off with creating permission guardrails. What I mean by permission guardrails is basically defining sort of a boundary across all your accounts within AWS, which basically tells us what are the maximum available permissions across your AWS accounts. Then you go deeper within a specific account and create general workforce permissions. These are sort of the permissions that you create for your users that grant them permissions to access resources. And finally, dial in permissions over time. So you can start broad when your projects are new, your workloads are new, your applications are new, and then use tools that AWS provides to dial in permissions over time when access control patterns settle. How does, so we know that this is a threefold process, right? How does this translate into tools that AWS has to help you in this space, right? Let's start with permission guardrails. We have a service called as AWS Organizations, which basically allows you to manage and govern across multiple accounts. One of the specific things that I'm going to talk about in terms of AWS Organizations, I'm not going to go too deep, but I'm going to talk about its ability to set permission guardrails across your accounts. So when it comes to the general workforce permissions, this I'm assuming you are a little more familiar with, is creating IAM roles and policies and actually granting them to access resources in your account or across accounts. Finally, we have a tool called as IAM Access Advisor that I'm going to demo and show you more in detail, which is going to talk about how you actually use the information provided by Access Advisor to dial in permissions over time. All right, so let's focus on organizations. As a very high-level overview, what organization helps you do is centrally manage and govern AWS accounts, right? You can use organizations to consolidate your bill across your accounts. You can use them to set permission guardrails, which I'm going to go much deeper into. And then you can also actually use organizations to manage and group your accounts into cost centers and whatnot. So what we've started to sort of talk to customers about is to use accounts as hard boundaries for their resources or their applications or their microservices. So far, customers have been using policies, but resources are much harder boundaries around, accounts are much harder boundaries around your resources, because you would need to use roles and resource permissions to actually give access to across accounts, right? What organization lets you do is group these accounts, and you would have multiple of them into logical groups called organizational units or OUs. And then basically you can sort of create like a tree-like hierarchy A lot of customers do this differently. Some customers replicate their cost centers using organizations and create accounts based on their cost centers. Some customers create OUs based on their different environments, dev, test, prod, sandbox, whatnot. And other customers basically categorize them by microservices and have a bunch of accounts for a specific microservice that they have. So as I mentioned, I'm going to go deeper into one aspect of organizations. Obviously, there is a lot more that you can do with AWS Organizations. My colleague Raymond, as I mentioned, is going to do a talk that goes deeper into sort of going into organizations broadly at 11. So do tune into that if you want to know more about AWS Organizations. The stuff that I want to specifically go deeper into is the ability to set permission guardrails using organizations. You can do this by using what we call service control policies, or SCPs. And you can basically, when you have created this tree-like structure for your organization, you can essentially add an SCP to any part of this node. So it could be added to the root, which basically means it's added across your organization. It could be added to a specific subtree by adding it to the OU, or you can even add SCPs to an individual account within your organization. So another thing, so when you attach an SCP to a part of a node, the policies or the permissions that you have within that SCP actually trickle down to the entire tree that's below it. So it basically gets inherited through the tree hierarchy. Now, an important or key understanding with respect to SCPs that I wanted to clarify is that SCPs actually do not grant any permissions, right? I'll repeat, SCPs don't actually grant any permissions. They just help you define the maximum available permissions for that set of accounts or group of accounts. If you want to actually provide permissions to a user or a developer on an application, you need to do that within an account using IAM roles and policies. So this is an illustration of sort of how to get started. How to get started and setting permission guardrails. So you begin with sort of nothing in here. You have all access, right? You would create your organization and attach an SCP that defines sort of the maximum available permissions or the allowed permissions for different accounts that would come into this organization. You create your accounts and group them into OUs, attach SCPs at all these levels. Finally, you define your IAM roles and your IAM policies, and then finally attach the IAM policies to the roles, and that's when you actually grant permissions. All right, now that we've talked about SCPs and organizations, the next part is IAM roles and policies. I can go on talking for days about IAM roles and policies, right? But for this session, I'm going to keep it light. The only thing that I wanted to talk about in detail is the fact that there is a reason that you don't see IAM users on this image. It's because we don't recommend customers to use IAM users, but actually use IAM roles. The reason is that IAM users either have console passwords or access keys, which are long-term credentials and are inherently not as secure as IAM roles, which have short-term credentials that you can rotate continuously. If you want to go deeper within workforce permissions, you should attend Bridget's session. She goes a lot deeper into managing permissions at scale using attribute-based access control. And that's from 5 to 6 today. So she made me put this slide, like a specific slide, because she's my manager and she paid me to do it. But all right, I'm actually going to take a dig at Bridget later in the session as well. So just letting you know. All right, now, so for the focus of this session, right, let's look at the tools that help you dial in permissions over time. It's basically a very simple approach. In order to get started, you define your guardrails and your IAM policies in a way that are broader by nature, right? Because you don't know, let's say you're starting a new project or you started creating new microservices, you don't even know what services you're going to use, what resources are going to be helpful in that case. So being least privileged at day one is very hard. So what you can do is create your permission guardrails based on your business requirements, and then dial them in over time using tools such as Access Advisor that I'm going to talk about. So let's talk about Access Advisor. So Access Advisor is a feature within IAM. It basically provides you the last accessed information for your services. So it basically tells you what are the list of services that are permitted, when were they last accessed, and by whom were they last accessed, right? They have been available for IAM entities, so you can actually go to the console into a specific IAM user or a group or a role or even an IAM policy and go to the Access Advisor tab on the console, and it basically gives you a list of services permitted and the last access timestamp. We actually made them available through APIs as well, so you can actually automate against this information. It basically generates a JSON report that you can store and like mine data over it and use it. So something I told you in the beginning that we launched something on Friday. So basically on Friday what we did was we extended Access Advisor to cover AWS Organizations. So far Access Advisor was available for users, roles, and groups. But now you can get the same information, services last accessed, when was it last accessed, and by which account. You can get that at an account level, an organization level, or even an OU level. So that helps you confidently set permission guardrails because it gives you information about whether a service was accessed or not. So it's very simple to actually, in terms of the process, it's much simpler than Bridget trying to find Twitter followers. She's very adamant about that. So basically you start by determining the services last accessed, right? Use Access Advisor, get this list of services and when were they last accessed. Now you compare them to the permissions that you already have and permissions to the services that exist within either IAM policies or your guardrails and SCPs. And then the step 3 is when you've made that comparison, you basically remove unused permissions, and you can do this confidently because you have data with Access Advisor that tells you that this service can be removed because it's not being used or accessed. So this is how the Access Advisor tab looks for a specific, this is an example of a role, and this is how the Access Advisor tab looks like. So you might be familiar with permissions, trust relationships. You basically can go to Access Advisor. Now, if you see, there are certain services right here at the bottom that either haven't been accessed for a long time or have not been accessed at all within the tracking period. So by default, we just set the tracking period at 365 days, but you can sort of decide when you're using the APIs at least on what this tracking period needs to be. All right, now that you know that these 4 services have not been used in a long time, you can compare them to the services that you actually have access to manage. I'm using 60 days as sort of my definition of a time period for inactivity, but you can basically use whatever you feel like is your sort of organizational definition of the time period of inactivity. Now that you've made this comparison, the next step's pretty easy. You go into your policy, you edit your policy and remove permissions for the services that have not been accessed in a long time. Okay? All right, so let's talk about setting access controls confidently. I'm going to go a little deeper into the new feature that we launched, Access Advisor with Organizations. So as I mentioned before, the benefit really is that we've seen a lot of customers sort of fear the use of SCPs. They're really powerful, so it's right to be very careful with SCPs. But now with Access Advisor, you actually have the data to make confident decisions when you're managing permission guardrails. What you can also do is go in and actually analyze your existing SCPs if you have some. So quick show of hands, who here is already using Organizations? Okay, and who is using it only for their billing use cases? And who is using them to actually set permission guardrails, have set SCPs? All right, so it's pretty divided. So I hope after this session we have more hands in the SCP section. And so what we've done is we've also launched APIs for this new feature of Access Advisor with organizations. So if you're not a frequent console user, you can still use the CLI or APIs to get this report in the form of a JSON report. All right, I'm going to switch to a demo of this new feature, and then we can talk about the recap of what we launched. Yep. All right, so you're going to tell me, Ujjwal, you just said don't use IAM users and you're going to log in as an IAM user. That's not fair. I know that, but basically the specific case where if you don't have an IDP setup or if you're not federating in and you have a need for creating native users within AWS, you can create IAM users. The only catch here is that if you see, my IAM user actually has permissions to do nothing, right? It has permissions to do basically nothing. The only thing my IAM user can do is access a role, right? The only permission that I've given my IAM user is the ability to access a role, and all my permissions that actually access resources are attached to the role. This is sort of a best practice that we tell customers, that even if you need to use IAM users, the only permissions that they should have are ideally just accessing a role or accessing different roles based on the different job functions. So now that I'm in this role, I am going to show you what Access Advisor does for the role, right? So I'm going to go into this specific role, and I'm going to go to the Access Advisor tab. So if you see, I have the admin access policy, which is a very sort of broad policy, but it basically tells me that organizations IAM were accessed today. Service quotas, which is one of the new services we launched. I was just trying it out yesterday, so it tells me that I was trying this out yesterday. And then basically you can actually go down here and see that like things like ACM or auto scaling is stuff that I haven't accessed within the last 365 days. So I can actually go in and remove, detach this administrator access permission and actually attach a much scoped down policy to my IAM admin role. So this is something that we've introduced here. So how familiar are you with the concept of sort of master accounts with organizations? Because I want to touch with that with you first, right? So basically, for people who are not familiar, the master account in an organization is basically the account that you use to create the organization and invite different accounts into your organization, right? So this information that we have for organizations, because it's related to the organization, we didn't want member accounts to have all the data across all your accounts, right? That doesn't make sense. So this information is only available in your master account, and you'll sort of get a warning if you try to access this information in a member account to sort of log in into your master account and get this information. All right, so before I go into like actually showing you the Access Advisor report, let me actually go into organizations and give you sort of a lay of the land of what it looks like. So this is the organizations console. It gives you sort of a list of all the different accounts that I have in my organization. And I've basically organized it into dev, test, sandbox, and prod. Right, and each of my projects are here. So I'm a big fan of Pokemon. I know they did a presentation yesterday, so I basically named all my projects after all the Pokemon that I like. Obviously, don't do this in prod. You can if you work for the Pokemon company, but all right. So I have like 3 dev accounts here. I can go look at prod. I have 2 projects in prod, similarly in test, right? And you can also see a list of all your SCPs or policies. I've created a few. All right, so now let's go back to IAM. So on the IAM console, you have this two options basically. One basically lets you look at your org hierarchy, right? So this is how my org, and I sort of went through it in the organizations console as well, but this is basically how my org looks like. So this is how I've arranged it. Now what I can do is click on any of these and find out the access. So if I click on the root, that is basically sort of the node of my organization tree, I can find out this access report provided by Access Advisor across all my accounts that are there in my org, right? So it tells me RDS, Elasticache, and Glacier, etc., have been accessed by these of my accounts, and they were accessed today, right? Similarly, if I go to page 3, it tells me that guard duty was accessed 6 days ago in my Charmander dev account, right? So now you can use these permissions, and I'm going to do that. So let's go into my production, right? Because we all, at the end of the day, we all care about our production OUs. So what I've done is, for the purpose of this demo, I've basically attached a whitelist policy. We generally shy customers away from using whitelist policies, but we have 176 services, so it would be weird to take you through a report with 176 entries. So I've basically scoped it down with a whitelist SCP to give you some of the services that are here. All right, so as you can see, there are a bunch of different services the two different prod accounts that I have across them that they have accessed. Now, Game Lift and Ground Station are two services that have not been accessed in my account. That's because I'm not controlling any satellites in prod, right? I don't need Ground Station. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to go back to organizations, and I'm going to create an SCP which is going to set a guardrail that actually denies Game Lift and Ground Station. So I'll go here, I'll create a policy, and this is something that we've launched recently as well. We've actually modified to make it a very good sort of policy editor, and we've added like the UI. So let me just say demo SCP. District permissions in prod. So as you can see, it actually lets you drag, drop stuff, and like just select stuff, and creates the policy JSON on the side for you. So as I said, I'm going to like basically deny Game Lift and Ground Station. So I just search for them. I want all actions. Similarly, I will do Ground Station. Say all actions. And finally, I need to add a resource condition, because without that, my policy isn't complete. So I'm going to just choose one of them, because all I care about is all resources. Right? So now that my policy has been created, I can just give a name for it, deny in prod. I can create this policy. It tells me demo SCP is created. Go to organize accounts, go to my prod OU. There is this field, there is this tab called as service control policies. So if you see, my production guardrail is attached to my prod OU. This is basically the whitelist policy that I talked about, that sort of reduced the number of services that were allowed in prod. I'm going to further reduce it by attaching the demo SCP. And that's it. With that, you've attached the demo SCP. Now, the thing with Access Advisor is, because it aggregates data across your entire organization, it takes up to 4 hours. Generally, it's pretty much faster, so it's within the first 30 minutes. But in terms of sort of our SLA, we say up to 4 hours, just in case something goes wrong. So I'm going to do sort of like a cooking show here, where they've already have a cake in the oven, right? So although I attached the policy to my prod OU, I already cheated. I need to be in IAM. I cheated and basically replicated that in my sandbox. So if you actually go and look at the sandbox, it still has all the same services. That's because you can actually go and look at the attached SCP. It also has the production guardrail SCP attached. And the sandbox deny basically is a replication of the demo SCP that I just created. And now you will see that in the sandbox, ground station and game lift aren't there anymore. And you can verify this by just searching for it as well. Right? The other way of using Access Advisor is basically by analyzing your existing SCPs. So you have a bunch of SCPs here. You can actually go and analyze across the SCP. So for example, right, I talked about the production guardrail. Since my production guardrail is attached to two OUs, my sandbox and my prod OU, it actually collects the report across all the different accounts within these OUs and aggregates it and gives you the report for it. So if you can see, I have some prod accounts here, some sandbox accounts here, and it tells me the different services that were allowed by this SCP and when were they last accessed across all of the different accounts, OUs, or the entire route that it was attached to. So using this information, so as you can see, because I did not change my production SCP, game lift and ground station are still showing up here. That's because production OU still has that attached, right? But it's not been accessed either in my sandbox or in my prod. All right. So I took you through the demo for organizations activity. I also showed you how you can use Access Advisor for SCPs. So in terms of a quick recap, right, this is the model that we believe supports innovation, where you start up with a bunch of like guardrails, then go in and define specific permissions for your workforce, and then at the end use Access Advisor to dial in permissions for your guardrails and also for your IAM policies, so that you are least privilege as a journey and not at day one. Thank you so much. My name is Ujjwal Pogalia. As a reminder, please do complete the survey after the session. It definitely helps us improve the content that we provide to you.